I came here to talk about the kind of connection, nexus we call it, between climate change, weather underneath that climate change, because it is a subsidiary of that really. I've had arguments with meteorologists and others who say, no, it's weather. And climate and weather are two different distinctions. Well, I'm sorry, the climate has something to do with the weather.
Yeah.
And the incredible fact that the lead element of the federal bureaucracy in Washington on this issue, which only this past week was declared by the President in a national security memorandum to be a national security issue, and that's a movement forward, don't get me wrong, that's a movement forward, to have the executive recognize this, that the connection between the two is so serious that the lead agency is the Defense Department. Now that's partly because in the last 15 years, since the end of the Cold War really, your government has decided that most of the problems in the world are nails and need hammers. And so we have used the military instrument, statistically speaking, 5.6 times more frequently every decade since the end of the Cold War than we did during the Cold War. We are using the military to fix everything. Instead of diplomacy, instead of economic and financial power, instead of cultural power, instead of information intelligence and so forth, we're using the military. So why shouldn't the military flow into this gap that is totally a vacuum in terms of civil leadership? That's what it did. That's what your military will do. It'll flow into all the crevices and so forth. And let me tell you what that's produced to a certain extent. The Gallup poll I most recently consulted about 4 months ago raised the Congress of the United States at 9%. Most pollsters will tell you that's barely a rating, almost in the margin of error. But that same poll rated your armed forces at 73%. And I suggest to you, as a 31-year veteran of the United States Army, a military professional, that's dangerous. That's extremely dangerous. And no one understands that and fears that developing gap more than your military, from the lowest private to the highest general or admiral. That's dangerous. That is a direct threat to the civil-military relationship that, above many other issues, has kept this republic safe for longer than most in history. The military is the lead federal agency on climate change. And that's because really of a guy by the name of Admiral Mike Mullen, who became so concerned about this issue, and the fact that he's an admiral tells you something, because the seas are a big component of this, said to a group of people when he was chairman, get on this and don't tell anybody because I'll get murdered by my armed services committees and the entire legislature if it becomes public, but get on it. And so we started clandestinely, secretly if you will, this group. We met in places like Crystal City and so forth because we didn't want to embarrass or hurt the military who were in attendance. And as you might imagine, initially it was Coast Guard and Navy, but now it's pretty much everybody. And here's the first real reason the military is concerned. Call this enlightened self-interest, a little bit of altruism maybe, but mostly self-interest. And I'll back up a little bit and I'll tell you a story. In 2005, 3 or 4 people in here already heard this, maybe more, don't be bored. In 2005, the really best ambassador in Washington, Ambassador Ching He of Singapore, Singapore bats way above its weight in the world, intellectually and otherwise. You do that when you have 1.4 billion Chinese on top of you and you're a city-state. Call me in London when I was trying to recover from 4 years in the George W. Bush administration. I was still in that administration, but I was trying to recover. I had my wife there and we were trying to hide. And the phone rang in my hotel room and I said, oh my God, who's calling me in London at this? Picked up the phone and it was Ambassador Ching He. And she said, you got to get your boss to Indonesia. I knew what had just happened in Indonesia. Light bulb goes off. I said, you're right, Madam Ambassador, I'll call him right now. So I called the State Department of Operations. They put me to the secretary, and I said, you know, he said, don't worry, LW. He called me LW. You know, he said, don't worry, LW, got my ticket. I'm going. And he knew he had to go, and he was going because they didn't care about George W. Bush or Dick Cheney or Donald Rumsfeld or, frankly, anybody else from the administration. They wanted to see Colin Powell. The only people in Jakarta, in Aceh province, where he finally went, they only cared about him coming. And frankly, I think they probably would only have allowed him to come. And they also knew about his military experience. And they needed the U.S. military badly. So he went there, and when he came back, he said, Larry, I've seen Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I've seen nuclear war. I've seen devastation. 200-foot trawlers pushed by a 20-foot wall of water moving at 100 miles an hour or more, 100 kilometers inland, lying in trees. Lots of dead people. Eventually, we would learn over 200,000. So that got me really thinking. And it also got the military thinking, because Marines, soldiers, sailors, airmen were there for a long time, doing what they love to do. And I'll give you a little anecdote there. I was at one of your campuses earlier in the week, spoke to a class, and a guy followed me out. I knew he was a little older than the average student in that class, and he was a former Marine. And he said, Colonel, I really appreciated your remarks. When I was in Haiti in 2010, I really loved it. It was so uplifting. Rip those LCACs out and take them over that damaged terrain and deliver water and food. That was really wonderful. And he looked and he paused and he said, a lot better than killing people in Fallujah. So this is not a mission the military shuns. It's a mission we love. It's morale uplifting. It's something we like to do. But think about this. All the models guarantee us virtually, with something like 75 to 80% certainty, and for a military officer, that's certainty, that we're going to have these kinds of tsunamis, these kinds of storms, floods, typhoons, seismic eruptions that cause tsunamis and so forth, not every 100 years, as has been the case demonstrably over the last millennium, but every 10 years. Do the numbers there. If you were spending $10 billion on disaster relief and humanitarian assistance, you are now going to spend close to 100, if not more. And you're going to be very occupied with this mission, which I don't need to tell you takes away from time to do the basic mission, both training and exercise. That's enlightened self-interest, if you will, but it explains why the military is so energized over this issue. $100 billion is not going to be added to the military's budget. It's going to be, you're going to be told, do it. Do it and take it out of your hide. I'm not saying the military couldn't, I'm not saying the military couldn't tighten up a bit. We could have an audit, for example, which has been statutory for some years now, and we still haven't had one. And I'm going to take both these off if they don't quit squealing. We could have an audit, move away from, yeah, okay, I like to walk though. We could have an audit, and we could prove what Donald Rumsfeld told Colin Powell at one time: we lose $40 billion every year. And we do in the Defense Department. We can't.
You gotta just step backwards.
So I got to stay in one spot?
Well, just don't come this way.
That's impossible for me, so I'm going to throw your microphone away in a minute. We had a second reason for being seized of this issue, and it was identified to me very clearly about 6 months ago. It was when we released sea rise tables to all the installation commanders who are on the West Coast, the East Coast, and the Gulf Coast. And I'm most familiar with the East Coast because I'm actually down there, you know, about 40 miles from Norfolk in Williamsburg. We went to Norfolk and we briefed the people in Norfolk, and you know, you could pick their jaws up off the table. Norfolk is the largest set of sea-related facilities. Aircraft carriers call there. Aircraft carriers indeed are maintained and retrofitted there and so forth on the eastern seaboard, and one of the largest in the world. Well, they're going to go underwater. And so we've been telling them that they have some choices. Homeland Security in particular has been trying to kind of guide them. There are 14 political jurisdictions there, Hampton Roads, Yorktown, Chesapeake, Norfolk itself, and so forth. And some want to build a 4-meter wall, some a 6-meter wall, some an 8-meter wall, some want to relocate, and so forth. And there's a price tag attached to each one of those, and so they understand and they've got to work this out. It was so bad that you actually had tidewater coming up from the Norfolk region and going into Langley, the Tactical Air Force headquarters, so that you had 16 inches of water on the runways, and the F-16s and F-15s there couldn't take off. Because with that deep water, you can't take a high-performance aircraft off. So the military is also very interested in sea rise. And let me tell you, when we talked to the mayor of Miami and others, they got interested too. And now they're so interested that they're looking at the $26 to $100 billion worth of high-value real estate they might lose in the next 35 years. That's my grandchildren and my children's lifetime. So that's the second issue the military is really looking at, sea rise. And then the third one, which you might be more interested in if my intelligence is correct, is the refugees we're going to create. They are awesome. They dwarf what's in the Mediterranean right now and elsewhere in the diaspora from Syria and Iraq. I was in Syracuse, Sicily not too long ago, and one of the royal family of Jordan came up to me and put his finger in my chest and he said, "I know who you work for. I know who you work for. You go back and you tell that man you work for that there is in every Jordanian household 1 or 2 or 3 Iraqi or Syrian families." Do you know how destabilizing that is for our little country? And I dare say it's similar conditions in southern Lebanon and perhaps portions of Turkey. Well, that's a few million. Wait till you see 100 million. And when you put the models down and you simulate and you do gaming, you find that by 2040, 2050, these people are on the move. And they're on the move because they have no water and no food. A lot of them are young, a lot of them are male, and some of those are going to be carrying a Kalashnikov, an AK-47, and at least a day's worth of ammunition. So what we find in these simulations is that what we call the peer powers, you can name them, you know, they run from Beijing to Tokyo, through Washington and San Francisco, the peer powers, who incidentally, in these models, for a time period in the 21st century, have it better off. We actually have more arable land. You can farm 6 months out of the year in southern Canada, and maybe even in central Canada. You're applying the Arctic regularly. You can even conduct search and rescue up there because you've got places you can put helicopters and so forth, which in the past you couldn't because the ice is melting. So we have it better off. We're looking pretty good. We can raise more crops, higher yields. We got more water. Sometimes that water is going to be hard to deal with, as it was in Louisiana. We're going to have lots of flooding. But basically, we're better off. So guess where these people are coming? And in these simulations, by 2065, we're building walls and manning them with machine guns. And we've already seen a little bit of this. The Thai actually turned back a boat. It was policy to turn back the boat. And it went out and sunk. We've had the same thing on a smaller scale in the Mediterranean with the Cypriots, the Greeks, the Italians, and the Turks. You just simply tell your Coast Guard, don't let them land. Turn them around. And the rickety craft they're in, leaking often and not anywhere prepared for that amount of passenger load, turn around and you know what you're consigning them to. Well, we had people in the international group in particular, Europeans in particular too, who objected to these game results when they were briefed. And then, of course, the game briefer, with complete equanimity, matter-of-fact, detailed language, said, wait a minute now, you had Germans in this simulation. Former military officers, former Bundestag people, former BND people, intelligence service, academics who are, you know, experts in the functional areas that are needed, like geology and so forth. They had to sit down. Their own people participated in these simulations, as did the Chinese, the Indians, the Japanese, and so forth. So these were reasonable people making decisions in this period under some very stressful circumstances that included what Donald Trump is suggesting right now. Build walls and shoot people. You know, that's how you take care of this incredible refugee flow. Your military, I can tell you right now, does not want to do that. So that's another issue. We call that a principle issue, a moral issue, an ethical issue that the military is seized of. That means martial law. It means a constant surveillance. It means probably the end of our republic. You know, Dick Cheney had one argument that I listened to closely. He said, if there's a possibility of a nuclear weapon going off in a major American city and killing 500,000 people, and in the residual another 500,000, I'm willing to do anything. And you saw some of the things he was willing to do. Render people, torture them, and everything else. Well, I agreed with one part of that rationale. If that happened, if you even judge by 9/11 and what we did after 9/11, we lose our republic. It'll be martial law, initially probably around New York or Washington or wherever it goes off. That martial law will spread, and we'll wind up with a dictator, probably military. That's not something the military wants either. So I know I've been rather gloomy, but this is what your armed forces leadership is looking at as a very distinct possibility with regard to this national security threat called climate change. And I'll tell you one other thing. When the military looks at its worst case analysis, which is what we always do, we do worst case because your lives are at stake when you're doing analysis in the military. When they look at it, they say, okay, to the experts, tell me what the risk factor is. Because we know what risk factor is. It's 60%. Okay, we're going to buy insurance. And insurance for us is resources applied now and throughout this time in order to do something about this. And here's one of the things that needs to be done that might interest you. If the 82 million people in Germany under Angela Merkel are willing to take the number of refugees they're taking right now, that means we would take, on a proportional basis, 4.5 million. Now just think about the political impossibility of that, and yet I'm telling you that in order to attenuate this threat, we may have to take many more than that over the next 60, 70 years. Because unless you relocate these people, unless you take some ameliorative action in this regard, you're going to have this problem later on in the century. How would you do that? Well, it's already happening. I told the story in there about the president of Palau in 1984, coming in to see my admiral at U.S. St. Pac, the Pacific Command, headquarters at Camp Smith in Honolulu, Hawaii. And he sat down, we'd given him a state visit welcome, you know, cannons had gone off and everything else because he's a head of state. And the admiral's at one end and the president's at the other, and the admiral says, well, what can we do for you, Mr. President? And he says, I need help moving my people. 1984, because he'd already looked at it. He knew Palau was going to disappear, going to go underwater. And today, indeed, we're moving them to Guadalcanal, to Australia, to New Zealand, and so forth. Well, write that problem a lot bigger, a lot longer, a lot wider, a lot more comprehensively. Look at Bangladesh, for example, where we did Operation Sea Angel right after the first Gulf War in 1991. And we had to pluck people out of trees in which they'd been for 2 or 3 days trying to survive with 15 feet of water under them. Bangladesh is going to lose about 25% of its country in the next 35 years. Where are those people going? Well, the Indians have said, others have said, you know, we're prepared, we will absorb, we'll do what we have to do. Well, that's the kind of cooperation and collaboration we need in this effort. We need everybody working on it. But we need people willing to take a whole heck of a lot more of these people than we're willing to take right now if we're going to move through this in a gradual, incremental, politically acceptable way Most people don't know that the Syrian civil war, the one ongoing right now, so bloody and so refugee producing, started with 200,000 farmers in Syria who for 2 years in a row didn't have sufficient water. Now the CIA tells me they probably had about a gallon of water for each family. Imagine doing farming, hygiene, everything else you do with water with a gallon a day. Incidentally, this same Jordanian monarch, member of the monarchy, told me in Syracuse that for the average Jordanian, certainly not him or any other Hashemite, but for the average Jordanian, it's about 2.5 right now. 2.5 gallons for everything you need to do per day. Delivered usually by a water truck in plastic jugs, like milk trucks used to do. Imagine that you're in that region and you have no water and no food, and yet you do have the ability to move and you have the ability to change that situation. What are you going to do? You're going to move and you're going to try to change that situation. That's what happened in Syria. And what flowed into that basically non-violent march on Damascus by those farmers was the Saudis, the Qataris, the Emirati, the Turks arming certain foreign elements and certain elements within Syria and trying to do what they wanted to do for so long, overthrow President Bashar al-Assad. And that's what we have. And oh, by the way, let me not hesitate to add, your CIA was right in there with them, arming those elements. In fact, your Pentagon has spent $40 billion in the so-called war on terror. That's $40 billion on small arms, arming some of these elements in hopes that they would do our bidding that are now being used to kill our soldiers and Marines. That's how bad it's gotten. All of this started with not enough water. So the other aspect of this too that the military is looking at is something that might precede these massive immigration flows, indeed something that's already here, as Syria proves, water and food wars. In fact, if you talk to the military, they'll say, go look at ExxonMobil's headquarters, look at the pipelines under projection, or projected, the pipelines under construction, and the pipelines pumping, and look at the water, the dams and the rivers, and look at the food scarcity, and that's the future. That's the future of conflict. That's the future where you're going to be fighting, Marine, soldier, or whatever. That's the reason the military is seized of this issue. Any questions? Yes?
I'm sitting here thinking about climate change as it affects our USA itself. Just by virtue of the storms we've had recently,
Yes.
but part of that fits in with, I think, what you're talking about.
We were sitting in Norfolk watching Matthew
That
on
we
tenterhooks.
that we are going to be faced with in our country, on every coast, of having our own refugees
Within the country.
within the country that are having to move because
Yep.
of climate change.
We told the Marine Corps headquarters, Marine Corps Reserve headquarters in New Orleans, you should have been gone after Katrina. In fact, the whole city of New Orleans should have moved. It should have moved because the next one is going to drown it. And it's not going to take necessarily a Cat 5. It might be a Cat 4 with the right wind conditions and the right water surge and so forth. But how do you move? This is a dimension of the problem in some respects. How do you tell a city to move and get them to do it? I mean, how's Baton Rouge even deal with that? How do they tell New Orleans, you have to move? But we have said to the military, you got to move, you got to get out. There's no walls going to be built. Relocate. Put that in your budget, relocate. And that's, you're right. There are going to be refugees in this country.
We got our own problem.
Yeah, we do.
That we're not even facing up to.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yes, back there.
A lot of what you say, I hear it, I resonate with it. I'm wondering, what are things that ordinary citizens like the people in here could actually, how do we address some of these things? What are some practical things that we could do today?
Good question, and I couldn't have answered you until I came to Iowa. Not with specifics. I am stunned at what you're doing. you're already doing probably what any state could do, given the politics, the resource requirements and so forth. The fact that you've gone to wind so overwhelmingly, the fact that you're now looking at solar, the fact that you're adopting all across the state. I was at your Farm Bureau this morning, better farming techniques, better agricultural techniques across the board. The fact that your Farm Bureau realizes and doesn't care about the politics of it, except as it stops them from doing what they need to do. These issues, you're way ahead. You're way ahead. So anything you can do to support that, to encourage it, to make it move faster if you can, that's it. I talked with a young man who's running a solar program in Iowa. He wanted some contacts and some help, and I gave them to him. And I'll go back to Washington, and I'll tell the two investment funds we're working with, one with $6 billion already and one with $40 billion, I got a guy in Iowa you need to go out and see. Because what he's looking for is a little more seed money, a few more contracts, and so forth. Solar is just going down, down, down in price, and it's going up, up, up in capability. If I had to guess right now, I'm not good at it, but if I had to guess, the reason I don't gamble, if I had to guess right now, I'd say solar is going to be a huge component of our energy grid in the future. And a lot of other countries like China and Germany are betting on it too. It looks terrific in terms of the technology, the speed with which it's developing, and what it can deliver at an economic price. And that's what drives the market. And you guys have smelled that in Iowa, and you're doing something about it. That's wonderful. Yes?
Colonel Wilkerson, if I understand you correctly, you're saying that much of our climate change, most of our climate change problems have to do with hydrocarbon energy and the way we use it.
A good portion, yes, I think so.
Can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of cooperation on an international level in terms of dealing with that issue?
Well, as the mayor said, the Conference of Parties in Paris, COP21, and the agreements reached there, I think there's 55 nations now that are ratified or in some way have said, yeah, that's a commitment we agree to. And it's probably going to climb up from there. If they even meet 3/4 of what they promised, it'll be an immense move forward on a global basis, which you've identified, and I think is right, as the ultimate problem. The U.S. does it, even China does it, the rest of the world doesn't, we got a problem. U.S. does it, China doesn't do it, India only does it partially, we still got a problem. This is one of those challenges that is now coming along, meeting the sort of criteria that people have been talking about for a long time. You can't do it alone. And some people are saying the Westphalian state system, 1648 to now, that is to say sovereign states acting in that sovereignty, is going to the past. That we've got to think about something else. I'm an old dude. I'm not quite ready to abandon the state system yet. But I do see the need for far more intense, focused collaboration on a global basis. Talk to any trader in any commodity, in any corporate enterprise that spans borders, and he'll tell you the same thing. Hey, we've been doing this for 20, 30 years. You know, you have got to cooperate. You've got to cooperate. You've got to try and work together, at least on the fundamentals, the basics. Otherwise, you're not going to do it.
The projections that the Pentagon has done that you're talking about, are they based upon, quote, business as usual?
Pretty much. Yeah, they're based upon Shell burning its 20 trillion worth of assets, ExxonMobil burning its 60 million worth of assets, Petrobras burning its assets, you know, the Nationals burning their assets and so forth. No change in that, and a real heating profile that looks really dangerous.
Trajectory still going up.
Yeah, let me put it a little bit more sophisticatedly. We're looking at several profiles. That's one of them. That's the scariest, obviously. But we're also looking at others that contemplate a 2, a 3, a 4 degree increase in temperature. We're looking at scenarios where we're absolutely wrong in the computer models. And thanks for mentioning that. That's a real point with us. In the last 10 years, what we have found is the computer models are imperfect, and we're trying to get them better, but they're imperfect against us, not for us. They're not very often telling us we were wrong on the side of justice. They're telling us we were wrong on the side of the accelerated rate that this is happening. especially with things like Arctic ice melt. It's happening a lot faster than people thought it was. Deterioration of the Gulf Stream, the heat in the Pacific. These things have been modeled and predicted, and the predictions have been in error, and they've been in error against us, not for us. So we're worried about the models. We're worried about them from that perspective. You need so many variables. We'll find sometimes that you're missing one variable that you didn't have, and you put that variable in, it changes everything. You suddenly get a much darker forecast, for example. That's how complex it is.